Welcome again to the Roche Jones Duff House and Garden Museum. I'm Dawn Salerno. I'm the executive director here. Um, and the RJD is supported by grants from the Grimshaw Goodwitz Foundation and the Mass Cultural Council. So I want to mention that first because as a nonprofit, we do rely on our supporters, and you're all supporting us in another way. So thank you for being here. As I said, this program started as a collaboration with the Preservation Society of Newport County several years ago, and we kept it going because of for the RJD, I think it gives us wonderful access to great speakers. So to tell you a little more about the Fellows Program, I'm going to introduce Catherine Moran, who is in charge of the Fellow Program. Catherine.
Thank you, Dawn. I'm Catherine Moran. I am the Manager of Research and Scholarship for the Preservation Society of Newport County, and I do have the pleasure of overseeing our wonderful Research Fellows Program. The Preservation Society of Newport County protects, preserves, and presents 11 historic house museums, 7 of which are designated National Historic Landmarks. The earliest Hunter House dates from 1748, and our most modern is Rose Cliff from 1902. Our annual Research Fellows Program is an opportunity for scholars who have received at least a master's degree and emerging professionals to spend a year in Newport working and researching on numerous topics, which might include fine art, decorative art, material culture, landscape design, horticulture, social history, and historic preservation. Current Fellows projects range from surveying furniture of Jules Allard to projects which support upcoming exhibitions, like our forthcoming exhibition on Richard Morris Hunt, set to open at Rosecliff on May 30th. Priscilla and Laura this evening will be introducing projects. Priscilla's working on our collections catalog and has had the opportunity to look at a variety of materials throughout our collection. And Laura's turning her conservation science expertise to one of our most famous rooms, the ladies' reception room with the breakers. So thank you so much for supporting the Roche Jones Duff House and the Fellows Annual Lecture. I'll turn it over to you, Dawn.
Thanks, Catherine. So I have the pleasure of introducing our 2 speakers. And you're also good at Zoom. I see that you've already muted yourselves. Thank you for doing that. So we are going to have you please ask questions, but just save them till the end. We are going to have both speakers speak back to back, kind of consecutively, and then take your questions. So please, write them down, make a note of them. So first up to speak is Priscilla Bright. Priscilla Bright has earned a Master's of Arts in Museum and Artifact Studies from Durham University, Durham, UK. While at Durham, Priscilla selected research projects with Newport themes, authoring successful papers on Alice Vanderbilt's electric light with Newport electric light gown, and a Bernard Palissy earthenware platter with provenance linked to both Emile Gavet and Edward Berwin. In addition to a successful summer working as a museum educator and associate tour guide at PSNC, Priscilla has experience working as a gallery assistant for Galerie Beauté de Matin Calme in Paris, France. That's why I said it that way. The Guild of Boston Artists in Boston, Mass, and the Anchor Ben Glassworks in Newport, Rhode Island. After that, we will have Laura Bergemann. Laura Bergemann received her BS in chemistry from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a Master of Science in Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works, and a Master of Arts in History of Art and Archaeology from the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University, New York. She was a recipient of a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship as well. Laura further excelled in several internship and professional roles, including work as a Conservation Science Fellow at the Museum Conservation Institute, Smithsonian Institution, Washington, D.C., Conservation Science Intern at the Indianapolis Museum of Art at Newfields, Indianapolis, Objects Conservation Intern at the Frick Collection, New York, New York, and a Laboratory Assistant in the Department of Scientific Research, Sotheby's, New York, New York. So with that, I will ask Priscilla to come up to the mic, so to speak.
Hello. Hi, I'll go ahead and share my PowerPoint here so I can get that up. Thank you for the lovely introductions. I'm very excited to be here. So this is Myth Muse Mistress. It uh, it is a lecture that originally was a tour at the Elms that I gave, and I created this lecture. I was kind of given carte blanche to make whatever I wanted. But when most people ask me what I study, my answer, like what period of history I study, my answer is normally women. Um, and so this is kind of born out of that. I wanted to go through one of the houses and reframe it in a way. So I went through the Elms and looked at different depictions of women and kind of categorized them into these three archetypes that I saw of myth, muse, and mistress. So to explain that before I get in, myth is the women in the house who are mythological, who are being used to portray the family's virtues or beliefs that they want to show to other people. Then once we get to muse, that is any Gilded Age woman who has herself depicted in the house and is kind of idealistically shown as who she's supposed to be, and telling other women of the US who they were supposed to be. And then finally, mistress, these are the women who were historical to the Gilded Age people. So depict historical to them and were reduced down to their seductive, flirtatious natures alone as a romanticization to use them as decoration in the house. So I'm going to introduce the Elms here. We are in Newport, Rhode Island. This is the summer home of Edward Julius Berwin and Hermione Tori Sarah Vesta Berwin. And they would only live in this house about 8 weeks out of the year. So this house is primarily for entertainment and for showing how much money they had, because Edward Julius Berwin did not have the old money status of many other Newporters. He started off in the Navy and then became a coal magnate, while his wife was the daughter to the U.S. Consul to Florence, and her father also was a main exporter of Carrara marble at the time, which has a lot more impact when we're in the house because it is absolutely floor to ceiling Carrara marble. Um, so you can see her influence there. The Elms was built in 1901. Architect was Horace Trumbauer, and the interior designer was Jules Allard. Um, and it was set to be demolished in 1962. So everything in the house was sold off before then, right before we bought it and made sure that it didn't turn into, I think, a parking lot or a mall it was going to be. So some of the things we've gotten back. So the house is a real hodgepodge of things from other houses, things that stayed that were too heavy to move, things that we got back. And I think that was really interesting for this talk because it shows that this theme extends beyond the Elms and goes into other Newport mansions. So this is where we're going to start. This is right when you walk into the house. You have this relief over door right above the ballroom. And it is a statement. It's what the Berwins want you to see first. It's what Jules Allard wants you to see first, as you can see by his signature right here in the corner. So breaking this down, you have two cherubs, one representing patriotism with a military style helmet and a eagle dagger, and the other representing industry with an anvil and hammer. You have Hercules at the bottom with his lion's skin, and you have Athena in the middle. So if we take each of these individually, industry and patriotism is how, and masculinity from Hercules is how Edward Julius Berwin saw himself. And he is propping up Athena. So with his coal industry that is serving the US Navy, that is serving the American railroad system, he believes that he is building up the US. He is this great patriot and industrial man, which ironically is also the narrative that the people striking against him were using. But so he is holding up Athena. So when we tend to think of Athena as modern people, as a person who grew up reading Percy Jackson, I see her as the goddess of strategic warfare, a very strong woman. Um, but looking through Gilded Age sources, I saw her referred to as the patron of the arts and sciences. Um, and so this is where I find it interesting that they chose Athena to represent that over other figures such as Hephaestus or Apollo that could represent the same things. But they chose a goddess over a god. And that is because in this time period, the women of the US, their ideal is to be leisurely. And to be leisurely is to take part in things that don't generate capital, like the arts. So women and the arts are becoming more and more intertwined because it is seen as something that doesn't make money and that is gentle. And therefore, it creates this uh, objectification of women where they are nothing more than an extension of their husband's or their father's wealth. Having a leisurely woman is like having a diamond necklace, basically. So just like the house being an extension of the Berwyn's money, so is the wife. And so in preparation for reading for this talk, I actually read Bailey von Hook's book, Angels of Art, which if you're interested in this, definitely go read that. And she kind of describes how art and women's place, gender-wise in the US, are intertwined in this moment. And you can really see it as we go through the house. So moving on to our first topic here of mistresses in the house. I have it in quotes because mistress tends to be something that is slapped on in the aftermath that we put on women now without looking at their full context. So that's what I wanted to do with the women in the house. So as you can see, one of these women are original to the Elms, the other are from other houses, one being from the Berwyn's New York house. So starting with our French mistresses, Madame du Barry and Madame du Pompadour, they are mistresses of Louis XV, 18th century. And reframing these women, which a lot of modern scholars are doing, from mistresses to political players, really. These women had the ear to the king, they had influence, and it was the only way that they could have influence because they weren't privileged to be born into the court. Madame du Barry was actually born to a unwed seamstress, and the court was up in flames, up in arms about her being mistress to the king, not because she was mistress, but because she was low-born, and they knew that she now had political sway over him. So these were early politicians. This is the only way that they could get to where they are with the tools that they were given. And so then on another side of a mislabel of mistress, or a simplification really of mistress, is Costanza Bornelli. Bornarelli. She's most often known as the mistress to Bernini, prolific 17th century Italian artist. And later, she would also have an affair with his brother, and Bernini would send a maid after her with a razor blade to disfigure her face. But what they don't often say off the bat is that her husband was a student of Bernini. And as a 17th century Italian woman with very little lawful right to her own property or money, she relied on her husband and therefore relied on Bernini for her lifestyle, for her well-being. So if the husband of your boss in the scenario comes up to you and wants something from you, there's not much you can do. And we can see the same power play with Bernini's brother. Later on, she will become a successful art dealer in her own right after losing everything. Maria Causeway, this is my favorite story. Me and her have known each other deeply over the past few months from research. And so She is most often labeled the mistress of Thomas Jefferson, which is really funny, because her and Thomas Jefferson had one week in Paris together where he fell head over heels for her, quite literally. He jumped over a fence and didn't stick the landing and broke his right wrist. And then later, he writes her an 11-page paper with his non-dominant hand, um, saying how much she was conflicted inside for being in love with her, but logically knowing she was a married woman. She responds basically, "Oh, I'm flattered." And there isn't much exchange of flirtation. Additionally, if there was much exchange during the Paris event, Thomas Jefferson was the one who wasn't married, so he technically would be the mistress, not her. Um, Moving on to the dining room, this is a much more masculine space. You can feel it when you're walking through the Elms. It becomes a lot darker. Um, Opposing each other, we have virgin goddess of the hunt, Diana, and Caracalla. This is where we move on to myth of the Berwins wanting to say something about themselves through a mythological figure. And so I find this really interesting because there are men depicted throughout the Elms and in many other Gilded Age houses, but this is a really good example of the difference between depictions, where we have Diana being the most active woman in the house. She's actively drawing a arrow from behind her. She's about to knock an arrow to supposedly hunt, but she's still got this dreamy face. We can't really make eye contact with her. She's in these classical, gentle proportions. Her bicep, which has been knocking arrows for eternity, is soft and gentle and squishy, where it could be flexed. Meanwhile, Caracalla, infamous Roman emperor, who doesn't even have any arms in this depiction, seems stern. He has signs of age. He's active. Um, and he's also strong. And these are a lot of things that the women throughout the Elms are not allowed to be. All of the women are these cookie cutter ideals of what the Gilded Age women were supposed to be: soft, gentle, classical, patrons of the arts, symbols for their husbands. Um, and so that brings me to another quote from the Bailey von Hook book, where she said, "To be allegorical is not to be real." And I think that really stuck with me when I see these depictions of women that have been reduced down to an allegory, whether they were real or not. So continuing on with myth, we get to this ceiling painting above the stairs that actually went through, so that actually was a 18th century Venetian painting that was cut down, altered by interior decorator Jules Allard, and then put into the Elms. So this depicts Queen Tomyris with the head of Cyrus the Great. She's only ever recorded in the histories of Herodotus. She's an ancient sole ruler with one son who was killed by Cyrus the Great on his warpath to build his empire. Eventually, she will defeat Cyrus the Great in battle for this, behead him, and put his head in a bag of blood, saying that she promised to satiate his violent greed for killing her son. That's Queen Tomyris. But in this 18th century Venetian painting, she's been made more gentle. So we can see it's already happening before the Gilded Age. She's being presented the head instead. And I'm sure you're wondering where the head is. It was painted over by Jules Allard. So we're taking it down another step. We've painted grapes instead of the head. You can see the original in situ painting here as well. So she's been made more gentle yet again. And this painting was commissioned by a woman who had no male heir, but whose father had put his money into a trust that would only give the money to a male heir. So she was widowed and then had to find a new husband to try and get a male heir to get access to her family's money. And I believe she actually depicted herself as Tomyris because of this pearl necklace that she would have inherited from her mother, that was in her mother's dowry. diamonds are a girl's best friend because you can actually inherit them. So I have seen in this painting a series of three women, with Hermione Berwin at the end, the wife of this house, owner of this house, who she was 45 when this house was built with no children. All of these women had this dilemma of being a powerful, wealthy woman with no male heir. And it's a dilemma that's splayed millennia. So going on to Hermione Berwin and going into her room here, um, we don't get to know too much about her because there just aren't very many sources. We get to know that she threw amazing balls, that she was president of two New York nurseries, and that she donated $5,000 to one of those New York nurseries and was able to give money to her nieces. Finally, at this point in time, we're able to create generational wealth between women. So the and then, oh wait, she also did not pass any money on to her husband, citing that he had enough of his own money already. So two of the other women that we have in her room that originally would not have hung in her room, but are two Gilded Age women nonetheless, are my two muses to talk about. This is Gertrude Berwin and Charlotte Augusta Warren Greenough. Gertrude was Hermione Berwin's niece, who the Berwins took on almost as their own kids after their father died, after their parents died. And Charlotte Augusta Warren Greenough was lived across from the Elms. So in these two women's stories, I often have to search through newspapers and all kinds of other crazy sources in order to piece together a woman's life because there just isn't very much documentation about them. I draw out these stories of these women, of these two wealthy women who were born to make good connections for their family, who were taught how to be a upstanding, high-class woman, but whose entire livelihood could just be taken away at any moment. And that was reality for Gertrude Berwin, who had married a German baron. And when World War I started, the US government actually pulled all finances, all assets of any US woman who had married a titled German or Austrian man to make sure that they couldn't fund the war from the other side. This forced her to return to the US, divorce her husband, and reclaim full US citizenship. But if she didn't have her sister to come home and stay with, she would have been in this position where she was with her husband and a son in a foreign country with no money and no way out. She actually testified that the marriage was abusive, and so that just adds another layer to this situation. And then moving over to Charlotte Augusta Warren Greenough, she was she was actually set to be engaged to James Hazen Hyde. He was he was in the insurance business, and he threw her this lavish costume ball in New York that put him in scandal because the people who wanted him out of the insurance company claimed that he used company funds to put on this ball. We don't know if that's true. All we know is that he had to flee. He left to Paris. He had to call off the engagement. Charlotte was quoted saying that she loved him and wanted to marry him for that, and that she didn't care about the scandal. But because she was this high-class woman who had to maintain her family's name, she had no choice. We don't really know what happened, but we know that it got swept under the rug, and then a few years later, she was marrying the more upstanding William Greenough, and that she became a patron of Redwood Library here in Newport. And that was another thing that these Gilded Age women did to have something to do to provide for the community. They would extend what they were allowed to be. They would extend their motherhood. They would extend their patriotism. They would extend their charity to the community around them and uh, do things like be president of nurseries or patron libraries or build libraries. And so with that, I just have a few things to leave you with as you go to if you are inspired to go to the Newport mansions and walk around, where you can just think, who was this woman that's being depicted here? How is she being depicted? Who put her there? And what does she reflect in terms of standards for Gilded Age women? Or even what does a completely non-Gilded Age depiction of a woman reflect for standards of women today? So with that, thank you very much. I'll leave you with this picture of baby Hermione Bergemann. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Priscilla. So up next we have Laura.
Yes. So hopefully you can see my screen. I will put it into full screen for the PowerPoint, which hopefully you can all see now. And hopefully you can all hear me as well. So good evening. I'm Laura Bergemann, one of the Conservation Fellows at the Preservation Society of Newport County. And tonight I'll be discussing my research, which focuses on Behind the Boiserie, an exploration of the wall paneling in the ladies' reception room. To begin, the ladies' reception room is at the Breakers, and the Breakers is one of Newport's grandest Gilded Age estates. It was constructed in just over 2 years, between 1893 and 1895, for Cornelius and Alice Vanderbilt, who were then the scions of the Vanderbilt Empire. Their architect was Richard Morris Hunt, who, as you heard tonight, is going to be the focus of our upcoming exhibition in May, which I encourage you to visit. And the designers of this house included Allard and Fee on the first floor and Ogden Conment on the second and third floors. The ladies' reception room, or as I call it, the LRR, was installed in the Breakers on the first floor. And in fact, it's one of the first rooms that you enter as you come into the main entrance of the Breakers. It's paired across the hall with the gentlemen's reception room. We're not entirely sure how these rooms functioned during the Vanderbilt era, but we're pretty sure that these would have been spaces for guests to come, relax, and prepare themselves before entering one of these infamous parties within the Breakers themselves. As you can see, this room is beautifully painted and gilded and features this exquisite wall paneling, or boiserie, which is in the Louis XV style. And since the salon hews so closely to that motif, we call it and consider it one of America's first period rooms. This room, including all of the furnishings within it, were constructed by Jules Allard and his interior design company. You may notice that there's an asterisk there, and we'll come back to why there's a question about this. But first, who is Jules Allard? You've heard his name a few times tonight. He was born in 1832 and died in 1907, both in France. But we consider him to be one of the leading interior designers, if not the leading interior designer of the Gilded Age. He worked with over 300 clients, but rest assured that these were some of the most exclusive clientele that a designer could have worked with. Some of the wealthiest of the American aristocracy, including the Astors and the Vanderbilts. He was extraordinarily prolific and designed many, many houses, particularly in New York, but also here in Newport. And he's of significance for us at the Preservation Society of Newport County, as 4 of our 11 properties contain interiors that were designed by Jules Allard, including those of the Breakers, Marble House, the Elms, and Rosecliff. Part of my research here is of a much longer heritage of research that's been conducted at the Preservation Society around Jules Allard and his work, including research into his furniture production, the materials and construction used in some of his rooms. You're seeing here one of his most impressive rooms, the Gold Salon at Marble House, and also archival research into materials that live both here in the United States and also in France. This work was started by our former chief curator, Paul Miller, and complemented by work by our former chief conservator, Jeff Moore, as well as a former fellow, Ben Bowery, and a current fellow, Teo Lorenzo. All of this work that's been done in the past points us to one of Allard's signatures, which is the use of architectural salvage, or that is taking materials out of pre-existing homes, often those that belong to members of the French aristocracy in the 17th and 18th century, altering them and installing them into the New York and Newport houses of the American aristocracy of the 19th century. And it's to that end that we'll travel to a particular house in Paris, known as the Hotel Maigret de Serly. This hotel, which is actually a home for the Maigret de Serly family, is in the center of Paris at 106 Rue du Vieux Temple. It was constructed in the 16th century, but it was remodeled between 1776 and 1778 by the architect Pierre-Noël Rousset, and includes one of the designers was Gilded Age. I'm showing you the rear facade of the house as it exists today, but it's been altered and changed over time. The interiors of this house were notably lavish, and they were meant to be homages to different rooms at Versailles. You'll see in the corner that there's a room included there. That is one of the boudoirs that was formerly in this house and now is installed at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. When Cauvet was asked to design a room within this house, he was actually asked to design the main centerpiece salon that would be in this house. That was supposed to be an homage to the clock room that was at Versailles, which featured a clock, a barometer, and different attributes of the arts and sciences. We're extremely lucky that Gilded Cauvet actually created drawings, which are now held in the National Library in France, which show us some of the imagery that he was intending to carve into the walls. Here's a detailed design of another image of Athena, as you may recognize from Priscilla's talk, surrounded by two cherubs. We know this is for the house of Maigret de Serly because you may be able to see that just above or just below this design of Athena is the letter M, signifying Maigret. But what's the connection here between Cauvet and the ladies' reception room over 120 years later? Well, I'll show you now one of the panels, which is in our ladies' reception room. And hopefully you'll be able to tell that this is, in fact, the same image of Athena wearing her war helmet. We're missing our cherubs, but our crown of stars is still there, radiating their light across the panel. And I mean to go further here and not just say that these are the same image, but imply that these are in fact the same panel, and say that we think Jules Allard took panels outside of the Hotel of Maigret de Serly and installed them into the breakers in 1895. But this is a long question of research, and this idea of architectural salvage brings up even more questions for us. And so the scope of my research, which I'll relay to you tonight, really is three-pronged. First, I'm interested in the construction. What materials were used to put together the paneling on the walls? What was the wood type used? What plaster was used? And what kinds of paints are on these walls? Also understanding the condition. How have things changed over time from the 19th century installation and possibly from the 18th century moving to now, both intentional and unintentional changes. And finally, confirmation. We think that there are panels in this room from the 18th century Hotel de Maigret de Serly, but how sure are we? Where are those panels? Is the entire room from the 18th century or only parts of it? And so that will be the final understanding. Once we understand the construction and the condition, we'll be able to make inferences about which parts of this room are older than the breakers themselves. To begin understanding construction, as a conservator, our most important tool is simply our eyes and looking closely. So first, to understand the construction, we look closely at the panels on the wall. This is going to be a little bit difficult as we're not in the room together. I'll encourage you to come visit the breakers the next time that you're in Newport so you can see these sorts of details a little bit closer. But instead, I'll show you on the screen here two panels, one from the north wall, which features the clock at the center, and one from the west wall, which features the attribute of navigation. Now, on the surface, these two are quite similar. They both feature the same sort of creamy paint color. They're carved wood, and they each feature gilded foliage decoration. However, when we look a little bit closer, hopefully you can see that on the north wall panel, there are these parallel striations that run up and down the panel. And this is very suggestive to us of a kind of construction where there are planks of wood that are joined together and abutting one another, which are then carved and painted as one object. This is indicative of an 18th century construction, one that we would associate with Jules-Paul Cauvet at the Hôtel Maigret de Sailly. When we look at the west wall, however, there are no parallel striations that run along the panel. And instead, this is suggestive to us of a 19th century construction that we actually believe is something Allard created to furnish this room during the installation in 1895. This panel does have wood planks that are abutting one another. However, they're sandwiched in between flat, thin sheets of veneer that give a flat surface on which to carve out the decoration, to paint, and apply the gilding. So in fact, here we have two indications of 18th century and 19th century coexisting in the room together. We can look even closer. On the left here, I'm showing you the reverse of one of the 18th century panels, where you can see how that join is accomplished with a really beautiful dovetail. It's that bow tie shape that you see. And in the 19th century, when we actually remove a piece of the wall, we can see underneath the different planks, which are much skinnier, all sandwiched together with the veneer layer lying on top of them. Another way that we understand the construction is through sampling. And it really can't be overstated how much information we can glean from an incredibly small sample. I have a sample baggie here for you. You may not be able to see some of the samples which are inside of it. Some are smaller than others, but they all provide us with an incredible amount of information. I'm showing you on the screen here, the image on the left is the same clock panel that we've been looking at. It's from the very, very top. And where you see those little blue flags, those indicate an area where I've taken a sample. On the right is one of our samples that's actually been mounted into a block of resin, which allows us not only to handle it a little bit better, but also to flip the sample on the side. When we take a sample, often we can only see the top, which is inherently our latest or most recent layer, and the bottom, which would be our oldest or least recent layer. But when we flip that sample onto its side and we're able to look at it from the side, we can see all of the layers or all of the potential applications of materials that have occurred over its time. So when we look at our sample under magnification, both under regular illumination, as you're seeing on the left, and under ultraviolet illumination, as you're seeing on the right, we get a sense of that layer structure that I was just talking about, where our oldest layer is at the bottom here, at the bottom of the screen, and our youngest layer or most recent layer is at the top of the screen. Hopefully, you can see here that there is actually 5 layers which comprise this one sample, and it's the exact same sample we were looking at on our prior slide. We start here with this sort of white, pinky white layer, moving up to an orange-yellow layer, a sort of greeny off-white layer, a very thin tan layer, and a chunky white layer. With the benefit of looking at other samples, I can confidently say that what we're looking at here is 5 layers, which actually constitutes 2 paint campaigns. You can think of the first paint campaign as consisting of a primer, a base coat, and a top coat. And those are our bottom pinky layer, our yellow layer, and our thin green. And our second paint campaign, which we would consider an overpaint campaign, is our top thin tan layer and our chunky white. And importantly, I'll direct your attention to the ultraviolet. When we look at these in ultraviolet, our top white layer becomes almost completely opaque and it's incredibly black. Another point of inference or interest is that that first paint campaign, which consists of the 3 layers at the bottom, we believe actually to be the finish that Allard applied to all of the panels in this room, regardless of whether or not they were of 18th or 19th century origin, so that all of the panels were uniform within the room. Sampling like this gives us an incredible amount of information, but it's very discrete, and it only is representative of the particular area from which we took the sample. When we want to understand how far or where is this overpaint campaign and how far does it extend, we need to take ultraviolet light into the room. And this is our first foray into understanding condition. I'm showing you here two panels. Again, our Athena panel on the left and a panel which represents an astrolabe on the right. In the room, under normal light, they look very, very similar. Their paint is virtually the same color, they're gilded in the same way, and their dimensions are quite similar. However, when we turn the lights off and turn the ultraviolet illumination on, all of a sudden the story is different. When we look at the left, the Athena panel, we can see that that paint, that creamy paint, all of a sudden now fluoresces a sort of white-green color. You may see that the leaves and the star and Athena herself are now a dark black color. That's because the gilding, if it doesn't fluoresce, it's very absorbent. And that's what we would expect to see. Now the story is different when we look on the right and we see a very similar panel with what we thought was very similar paint, all of a sudden becomes completely black in color with only small areas of that green-white fluorescence peeking through. This is indicative to us that the panel on the right, the astrolabe panel, has been overpainted, just as we saw or suspected with that microscopic sample I showed you. When we move into the room fully, I'm showing you here a corner, which gives us a very good understanding of what went on here. That at one point, there was someone who went into the room and selectively overpainted only 2 of the 4 walls within this room. On the north and the west walls, we see this incredibly dark black fluorescent overpaint, and the east and the south walls retain the original Allard finish, which persists from the 19th century. A condition assessment like this would also include understanding not only where things have been overpainted, but where things have changed unintentionally. So where things are just getting old and naturally aging. I'm showing you 2 diagrams here, which you can see all little splotches of green and yellow, red, and blue. All of these are symbolic to me of areas where there are loss to the panels themselves, areas where we're losing paint or gilding, areas where the panels themselves are cracking or undulating due to different condition issues. This is very important as the ladies' reception room will be the focus of an upcoming conservation treatment, large-scale conservation treatment. We need to understand what kinds of problems are being presented to us as we look at these panels more deeply. When we focus on the panel on the right of the screen, which is one of our music panels, we were also able to remove this panel from the wall, which we didn't expect to be able to do. This panel had previously been restored, which we weren't also aware of prior to starting this research. And it's for that reason that we're actually able to remove it. I'm showing you on the left, the reverse of this panel, and on the right, the void that had been left in the wall once this panel was removed. What we were hoping to see was that characteristic 19th century veneer sandwich. So on the back, we were hoping to see maybe an Allard signature, but definitely a 19th century veneer sheet. And instead what we found was 20th century plywood. We didn't know this going into the room that there had been any conservation treatment or restoration as we might understand it prior to this. But this is very helpful in helping us understand not only how the 18th century and 19th century changes have occurred over time, but also how the room has developed into the 20th century. The last aspect of condition that we want to assess in this room is another unintentional change that corresponds to the color within the room. For the upcoming exhibition of Richard Morris Hunt, we actually took a wall sconce off of the wall, which will now be in the exhibition. But removal of that wall fixture allowed us to see that there had been paint underneath that fixture, which had been untouched for 130 years. It may be difficult to see on your screen, but there is a definite difference between the 2 paint colors, between the paint that had been exposed on the wall and the paint that had been covered by our wall sconce. And there is a definite warmer, pinkier tone to the paint that had been covered for up to 130 years. This is the function of fading of paint when it's exposed to ultraviolet illumination, to sunlight, and to incandescent light, as all have been present in the room over its history. And we can imagine that the ladies' reception room may be a little bit pinker than it is today. The final prong of my research was confirmation. understanding what's 18th century, what's 19th century, what doesn't fit neatly into those bounds. Given all of the information that I presented to you tonight and a little bit more, when I click this slide, you'll be able to see that everything that's highlighted red, those panels, we can be assured, are 18th century and created by Gilles Cauvet, with some alterations to make them fit into the ladies' reception room. The 19th century blue panels are those that were created by Jules Allard during the installation in the breakers in 1895. But curiously, there is this overdoor panel, this purple panel, which I've marked out as the 18th and 19th centuries. When we see it a little bit closer, and there's actually 3 overdoors in this room, which are all the same, we can see hopefully that the construction is very, very flat. There's no parallel lines, no cracking. And so the panel itself seems to us to be a 19th century Allard creation. But the foliage decoration that you see has actually all been nailed on. It's not carved in. And when we take samples from this decoration, we can see at the top an incredibly thin gold layer, a red bowl preparation, and this very thick white base layer, all from the 19th century. But sitting underneath is an incredibly fragmentary debris layer of gold. And this gold to us shows that this panel was actually, or this decoration was actually part of an 18th century panel. Maybe not from the Hotel Maigret de Seralie, maybe from some other stock that Allard had, but is certainly older than the actual panel it is now nailed onto. All of this information that I've presented to you tonight helps us not only understand the past of this room, but also its present within the museum context, and gives us a lot of information for how to protect it for the future. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation tonight, and I look forward to any questions that you have for me. Thank you very much.